At the end of last month, solar electric car company Aptera published a video showing the first long-distance road trip involving one of its very first production intent vehicles. Covering well over 300 miles on a single charge, company co-founder and co-CEO Steve Fambro drove Hermes, Aptera's track testing production intent vehicle, from Flagstaff, Arizona through to Hackberry, then Lake Havasu, and then finally the Imperial Valley in California, following along the famous Route 66. I assume that kicks were got on Route 66, but not the type that you might traditionally associate with that particular jazz standard. And this time, the changes brought forth not only some great video opportunities for Aptera's team, but also some real-world validation of the Aptera's proprietary embedded solar panel system, where power peaked at over 545 watts of solar power, even on a partly overcast spring day. But what really grabbed everyone's attention was the subsequent video published by Aptera at the very end of March, in which it revealed that, during that particular test run, Hermes averaged a fuel efficiency of 122 watt-hours per mile, which is equivalent to 8.3 miles per kilowatt hour, or, if you prefer, 7.58 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometres. The real-world results are less than the 100 watt-hours per mile that Aptera is shooting for in its production video, but as Aptera notes in its video and blog post on the subject, Hermes, the production intent vehicle used for this test, was built for quick disassembly at the test track, rather than range testing. That doesn't mean the production vehicle will reach the claimed efficiency target, but it does explain a little bit of the test results we saw in this particular case. I know some folks watching this will be upset that the trip included an elevation drop and that we didn't cover that fact when we did our news roundup show on Saturday featuring this news story. I'm afraid I missed that. It was my wife, not I, who spent teenage years in Arizona. I'm sorry. Nobody is perfect. That said, I have since looked at the route they took, and based on my calculations, I reckon there was a total elevation drop of around 13,300 feet and a total elevation gain of around 6,500 feet, leaving a net downhill of just over 6,500 feet. Given that it's more a gentle downhill than a rush down the mountainside, and the distances involved, and given that the efficiency quoted is vastly much better than anything else with 3 or more wheels, I honestly still think this is pretty impressive. Nevertheless, this first range test shows promise, and hope that Aptera will be able to make good on some of its promises for its solar EV. But while these videos have got fans and reservation holders super excited, what's the reality that people will actually embrace a vehicle like this in the real world? Today, I'm hoping to figure that out. Before we get too far into this video, I need to acknowledge 3 things. 1, I am a fan of weird, quirky and unusual EVs, and 2, I'm personally among the hundreds of folks who put down a $100 deposit to secure a place in line for the chance to spec and build an Aptera if they do make it into production. 3rd, because so many of you asked when I made my initial reservation, I do have a link in this video's description to a discount code for anyone looking to place their name on the pre-reservation list for an Aptera. And after a certain number of referrals, Aptera is promising folks whose discount codes are used the lofty perk of a free base-level Aptera, and the last time I looked, I think my referral codes were pretty extensively used. However, because we at this channel have a very, very strict rule that I set about not financially benefiting from vehicles and companies we cover, I have agreed that should Aptera reach production and should my referral code tallies be high enough that I've technically quote-unquote earned a base-level Aptera, I would work to have that car auctioned off for a charity so I didn't personally benefit from the program. I'd then buy any Aptera I chose to buy at full list price without any discounts. Given how many times we are accused of shenanigans by haters, I wanted to make sure that this one was spelled out really, really clearly.
Transport Evolved LLC does not endorse, promote, or accept sponsorships, gifts, or rewards from companies inside the automotive industry. Transport Evolved is committed to impartiality and independent reporting. BYOB. Please see your doctor if your awesomeness continues. Individual results may vary.
Those things out of the way, let's look at what I want to get into in today's video. Namely, that while Aptera has managed to continue development to a point where a production vehicle is looking very plausible, although far from a certainty, what would need to happen for Aptera to become popular among car buyers? I'm going to remind you a little bit about the history of the company, refresh a little on what Aptera's current SEV offers, and examine how it's dramatically at odds with current automotive trends. Then I'm going to examine what might need to occur for there to be a future where, yes, the Aptera might become more popular than you'd think. Let's start with a very, very abridged history. About the time I got into electric vehicles, 2006-ish, a startup broke onto the scene in the US offering a three-wheeled, super-efficient vehicle that was built around an ultra-aerodynamic design using lightweight composite materials. The vehicle was called an Aptera, a name derived from the Greek for wingless flight, and was initially promised as a plug-in hybrid and short-range battery electric vehicle, and by 2008 had amassed reservations and significant press interest. It was featured in Wired magazine. It gained significant funding from Google. Significant for a startup, that is, but far less so for automotive development. And in around 2008, its co-founders, Steve Fambro and Chris Anthony, appointed automotive industry executive Paul Wilbur as company CEO, before Paul Wilbur then unceremoniously ousted them as employees in 2009. I'm not going to delve too much into the next bits of history, but depending on which fan you ask, Wilbur's time as CEO changed the company's direction, moved away from its original intent, and became focused on what we in the gaming world might generously call side quests. After applying for federal loans under the Advanced Vehicle Technology Manufacturing Loan Program, and being rejected because Aptera's vehicles were three-wheelers and the program at the time only supported four-wheelers, Wilbur and his newly hired executive team teased a four-wheeled model. But like the LEO ultra-efficient gasoline vehicle of the time, Aptera's fate was unfortunately not good. It competed in the Automotive X Prize, but failed to finish the competition. The company ended up running out of money and its remaining assets were sold off in 2011. Based on the technology Aptera had the first time around, I want to be clear that it would have struggled to be competitive in the marketplace. Its range as an EV was limited due to the battery tech at the time. There wasn't a lot of demand for small, efficient three-wheelers, and there was a lot of anti-EV sentiment out there. And at this point you might ask what's changed since then, but don't worry, I'll come to that in a second. It took years for Aptera's original ousted founders to rebuild the idea of Aptera, to reacquire some of the essential design IP, and to bring the vehicle back from the dead. In 2019, the company announced its return, this time with Fambro and Anthony firmly at the helm, with a promise not to hand over the reins for the foreseeable future. Many of its original employees who worked at Aptera in its first iteration returned, and thanks to dramatic advances in composite materials, battery technology, and power electronics, the resulting vehicle is far more than the original could ever have hoped to be. It has a longer range, it has far more efficient solar panels, and it is more aerodynamic thanks to computer-aided design and rapid, iterative virtual prototyping. So, brief history aside, let's look at my personal experiences with the brand. Last year, I was lucky enough to get behind the wheel of an earlier pre-production prototype, having previously interviewed team members at the firm, as well as having a few ride-alongs. The version I drove last year didn't have production components, and the first time I took it out on the road, things didn't go too well. The car overheated, but as Chris Anthony was man enough to admit, which, by the way, for a company CEO, is extraordinarily unusual.
I have to apologize. A severe tactical error on my part had me taking out two very nice investors from New York on a pretty vicious test ride before you got into the Aptera, and apparently I did not initiate the startup sequence as I was supposed to, which turns on the fan and the cooling. And Matt and Quincy and Sarah have chastised me, and I'll have to take a beating later. But we really did drive the piss out of this vehicle before you came, because we knew you wanted to drive the piss out of the vehicle. And we thought, well, 3 days of driving would be plenty to let you have a glorious test ride in in the Gamma Aptera, but unfortunately they threw me into the mix and now I killed your test drive.
The company hadn't yet built the final thermal management system for its power electronics, and at the time it required a switch to be manually activated to turn on, which Chris Anthony had failed to do. A short rest for the car and a quick lunch from me at Aptera's headquarters meant that we were able to go back out after lunch for a second time, and things were so much more impressive. The vehicle I drove was quick. It did everything I was told it would do, and while that prototype used in-wheel motors, something the initial production run has opted to ditch in favour for more conventional and more readily available in-board power, it gave me an intriguing glance into what a production vehicle would be like. And I still quite like what I saw back then. So while my next part of this video, will it make it into production, isn't really part of the original idea that I had for this video, which was, will people actually buy it, or rather, what needs to change for people to want to buy an Aptera, I think it is worth making a little side street detour at this point to talk about my thoughts right here, right now, about Aptera's production possibilities. And while I personally, as a fan of quirky EVs and Fatboy Slim, want the brand to succeed because it embodies so much of what I think vehicles should offer, not to mention the brand's commitments to right to repair, I want to put that to one side and answer with my much more pragmatic journalistic hat on. Right now, I think the team of Aptera have the engineering capability to bring that vehicle to market. That is, given unlimited resources. In fact, given unlimited resources, I think it would happen in pretty short order. But as this iteration of Aptera has been refreshingly open about, making a vehicle and bringing it to market is very expensive. In the case of Aptera, it's been more expensive than its executive team thought it would be. And if you ask me personally if I think I'll actually ever own an Aptera, well, I don't want to say this. I think I probably have to answer no, but that's because of exterior forces in the world, and especially the US right now, more than anything else, more than anything Aptera's doing. Although, I will admit, Aptera's need for funding is a blocker to production. Although, yeah. Thanks to the current occupant of the White House and his pet CEO, or should that be vice versa, the world for EV startups is about to get a whole lot more complicated. Federal incentive programs are being halted and pulled. Even already committed funding is being illegally withheld as the federal government reneges on its previous contractual obligations. And believe it or not, there is a significant amount of people out there who view any electric vehicle as a Tesla. I know it might be hard for some of us who drive EVs to grok, but I have heard from several friends and acquaintances who Uber and Lyft, and they are saying eerily similar things. When someone who gets inside an EV who isn't a car person and who isn't all that attuned to the nuances between the different EV brands, there's quite a lot of potential for hostility. One of our Transport Evolved Discord members has been harassed while driving an eGMP-based EV because one of their customers mistook it for a Tesla. And I've heard of people being harassed at charging stations for similar reasons. Luckily right now that kind of behaviour is an outlier and is not super common, but nevertheless it is happening. I'm not saying here that everyone is anti-EV because the numbers clearly show that EV sales are continuing to rise for brands that aren't owned by Elon Musk. I bet you did not see that one coming. But how do I put this? If you consider yourself average knowledge about EVs or automaker brands in general, there's going to be a huge number of people who sit below you on the bell curve. There's an excellent XKCD comic about that very topic. In short, the world Aptera now exists in isn't the world that existed in 2019. Things are even less welcoming towards EVs than they once were, and I'm going to admit that Aptera faces a significant uphill struggle. The stock market is currently in freefall. Tariffs are being announced on what feels like a somewhat random, often retributional basis, and all of that together isn't particularly conducive to a company still trying to raise funds and find its feet to build a new, unusual type of super efficient vehicle. You'll notice at this point that I've also not even begun to discuss the thorny subject of market suitability in North America, where unfortunately most people seem to think a vehicle needs to have at least 4 seats in order to be considered practical, even though at the same time the majority of people commuting to and from work every day never have anyone else in their massively oversized, expensive vehicle. And that's because an entire lifetime of auto industry advertising has portrayed the automobile as an extension of self that one should never, ever compromise on. And things like fewer seats are, sadly, often portrayed as a compromise.
The 1957 Plymouth. Compare the fins. Those fins.
And look, I'm a mongrel of many different countries, and I've been lucky enough and privileged enough to live somewhere where public transit isn't seen as the last resort, where small and fun trumps overpowered and boxy, and where cycle parking is often expected rather than treated as an optional extra to prove just how green and environmentally friendly you are. And I want to remind you that I grew up in a carless rural household in the 1980s where going on the weekly shop meant walking a few miles before jumping on the 4 times a day train to our local town. In my family, resilience and adaptability was something we as kids had to learn. If we wanted to go somewhere with friends or went on an after-school trip, we had to figure out how we were going to get to where we needed to be. But most folks in the US, and I say most because I know there are many who did grow up in car-free families for different reasons, haven't had that experience. And many more of them would likely crumble if you asked them to exist without a car. There's a reason why the Smart for Two was treated the way it was by mainstream medias and buyers in the US and Canada, because it's different from anything they'd encountered before. It's the same reason why the Simpsons' vintage send-up of massive SUVs with the Canyonero still works to this day, 36 years after that episode originally aired. It's still true, in fact, probably more true today than it was back in 1988. But what if? What would actually need to change in our world in order for a vehicle like Aptera to be considered by more people? Because at the bottom of this thought experiment that is, I guess, this video, I think there is a future where it does make more sense for vehicles like Aptera to exist. And no, I'm not talking about that one guest appearance in the reboot of Star Trek that J.J. Abrams did. I have that framed picture downstairs on my living room wall. First, we need to see fossil fuels and energy in general become a whole lot more expensive. And given my electricity bill increases in recent years, electricity is regularly closing in on about twice the price per kilowatt hour in some parts of the world that it was a decade ago. And in other places, even more than that. And that means I don't think that future is as far away as some people think it is. And fossil fuels? Well, the drill baby drill mentality of the current US president, not to mention the destruction of national forests, will negatively impact the world's climate. Increased fossil fuel will increase global temperatures. And just this past week, we learned that some of the world's banks are now quietly and not so quietly advising their clients to be ready for the absolute certainty of a 3 degrees Celsius increase in global temperature. In addition, several major sources of fossil fuels are either at or near energy negative, which means it takes more energy to get them out of the ground, refine them, and get them to their destination than will be obtained from burning them in their end use. Even with the subsidies that the current administration will doubtless continue to pour into this dying industry, it's eventually going to become untenable. And unfortunately for all of us, that's going to happen after increased temperatures result in increased use of energy to try and keep things habitable. Even when we do eventually end up being forced to switch to cheap and abundant renewables, those increased energy demands will continue to drive the cost of energy up. And even in that world, a more efficient vehicle is kind of important. At 122 watt-hours per mile, the Aptera is, even in its pre-production form, dramatically more efficient than any of the competition, and it's difficult to imagine how little energy it actually uses. In some parts of the world, as Aptera's founders say, it should be possible to charge up the battery pack using solar power alone for an average daily commute. And that opens this vehicle up as an option for people who, right now, can't own a traditional electric vehicle due to recharging concerns and the fact they live in large multifamily dwellings. Now, I'm going to probably be a little persnickety here and point out that if your commute is under 10 kilometres, which is 6 and a bit miles, and if you are physically able, and doing so wouldn't threaten your safety or health, you probably should consider an alternative way of commuting, like cycling. And in a future world where equitable, accessible public transit and walkable cities existed, we'd not actually need privately owned vehicles. But I think in some countries that is a very long way away, and Aptera is a next best choice for the short term. That said, I also personally think we all need to get involved in local politics to push for more equitable and reliable transportation networks, along with those being zero-emission mass transit projects. If people's budgets are squeezed, finding a more affordable solution is going to be a top priority, and the savings Aptera could offer, based on the back of the napkin scrawling of mine, are pretty darned large. I mean, look, I own a massive Ford F-150 Lightning electric pickup truck, a small electric hatchback in the form of the Chevrolet Bolt EV, and an old electric motorcycle. And I groan when I have to use that pickup truck, knowing full well the cost to recharge it is going to be relatively expensive. Sure, less than it would be if it were powered by dino juice, but still probably more than twice as expensive as the other two options that I personally prefer to use. But cost of ownership isn't going to be the only driving factor. For Aptera to become popular, to sell in large numbers, it needs to be treated as more than a niche vehicle, and that is a difficult bit. That requires a massive sea of change, and that, sadly, is probably the biggest challenge facing the company right now. It doesn't look conventional, and society today is very, very, so frustratingly good at quashing anything that doesn't at first glance seem to fit in. On top of which, North America has a unfortunate long-standing automotive industry of being extremely ambivalent about vehicles that don't fit the standard mould. And if you are someone like us, who gets the engineering, I can imagine going for an Aptera is going to be far easier than someone who, referencing that bell curve comment from earlier, doesn't know or care about cars or vehicles in general. So for Aptera to make significant inroads outside of that geeky engineered demographic, which, to be fair, has for a long time been this channel's demographic, we're going to need to see a pretty wholesale societal attitude adjustment. But first, let's remind ourselves that attitudes around the world are different depending on where you live. For an example, let's talk about scooters, right? Not the kind of rideshare things that have become popular in recent years, but the older, what we used to call underbone scooters. And for that, we're going to look at Southeast Asia, where scooters are much more popular in some places than private cars, because they're cheaper to operate, require less parking, can be easily fixed, and thanks to the weather in those places, aren't so terrible to ride as they might be in the middle of Canadian winter. Although riding a moped in a monsoon is no fun. Because residents of scooter-friendly countries already had no problem with scooters whizzing around everywhere, their transition to electric scooters and the appearance of battery swap stations for the same were a really easy logical evolution of existing transportation infrastructure. The benefits they offered over internal combustion engine scooters, often two-stroke, made the transition even more of a metaphorical, no-thought-required decision. And look, Kate and I both owned, and enjoyed owning two-stroke motorcycles. It's another shared experience we both have from a simpler, less hateful time in our lives. Although the term enjoyed is kind of subjective. My MZ ETZ 125's clutch once gave up the ghost on the A4 near the Bath racecourse, forcing me to struggle, in freezing weather, back to Bristol with a... And Kate's multiple MZs regularly tried to kill her, but... I'm sorry I have to admit this, but I still like the smell of two-stroke in the morning. I also don't like what it does to the planet. And in a similar way, electric auto rickshaws in India have enjoyed a similar amount of growth because they replaced what was already on the road with something far better. But when it comes to Aptera, there's frankly been nothing like it. Sure, Akimoto had the market for a while with its quirky 2+3-wheeled, not quite a motorcycle. I personally love them. They are local to us here in Oregon, and to this day I still think they have a place in some parts of the world. But then I am also someone who thinks the Twike is an awesome evolution of personal transit, and yes, for my sins, I also thought the City L was a great way to blat around Bristol while most of my friends and family refused to even go near it. And that brings me to the need to societally challenge what we think a car needs to be. It requires us as a society to forego, or perhaps become insulated against, the hype of advertisers. We frankly need to eschew what the traditional ideas of the auto industry are like to maintain, that larger, bigger and faster is better. Because it isn't always true. Right-sized transit means driving a vehicle that's efficient for the trips we make, not spec'd for every eventuality. And in a world where influencers are the primary route for most automakers seeking to make an impression on the world, that level of impactful retrospection can be really difficult to achieve. As I'm sure you know, though, we never like to say never here, so let's see if this is possible. Statistically speaking, fewer people today are buying cars than they once did. More people are choosing alternative transportation methods, and while the auto industry would like you to believe it's not the case, there is a push away from the traditional auto industry bigger equals better mindset among certain consumer groups that could lay the path for alternatives like Aptera. It might be the weird-ass group of socialist sorts I hang around with, but we're starting to see a full-scale rejection of traditional capitalism. We're seeing people push against that toxic tech bro Silicon Valley ideal mindset, whether that's seen through the problematic lens of accepting Luigi Manciani as a folk hero, or the glee which many people have exhibited at some companies falling from grace with the accompanying loss of quote-unquote shareholder value. Slowly but surely we're seeing people take a stand against the kind of greed that got us to this very particular disastrous point. By the way, one of you lovely people recently tried to rise up ire against us by saying that Transport Evolved, specifically me, were anti-capitalist. The person writing the comment tried to imply I was therefore a communist, which I am not. But yeah, I do believe in democratic socialist values, which are different from communism, where we create a society that puts people before profits, and where people's basic needs are met. So, yeah, sorry, hun, I don't think the anti-capitalist declaration was the slur you thought it was. And as the US federal government, complete with its tech meme overlord, steals money from citizens' retirement funds, stealing because it's money which the individuals had placed in the care of the government during their work life, and as we're seeing funding for all kinds of societally smart and kind projects being slashed in order to give tax breaks to the uber-rich, we're also seeing people finally start to push back. We're seeing people ask, hang on, what does our future actually look like? And then when people realise that future isn't also rosy, oh, how can we make sure that that future is better than this utter bullshit we've got right now? The answer for some is to do everything they can to minimize the use of big tech, to shop local, to be as minimally impactful on the planet as possible, to be a solar punk, to share seeds, to give knowledge freely and offer time for good causes, because it's the right thing to do. Sure, right now, the world might feel like it's peak fascism, peak greed, and peak apathy about the needs of others. But as so many people know, ticks are always followed by talks, and I think there's one just around the corner. There's going to be a wholesale rejection of a whole lot of ideals many folks currently have about the world. Kate, the other presenter, Kate, not my woodworking wife, Kate, likes to say that regulations that impact big businesses and the wealthy are the compromise that the French came up with to take the guillotines out of the streets. And that it seems like a lot of oligarchs and businesses have forgotten that particular fact. So, as people get angrier and more impoverished thanks to the current administration's memory lapse, and if we are, as some posit, heading towards a massive crash and a market readjustment, a future need to reevaluate and rebuild, recovering from whatever the hell this is, I think we may have just found ourselves a future world where our transit needs to change too. What a car is and what it needs to be will, I think, need to invariably change in a world of increasingly expensive resources. It will need to be one of those concepts that has to be different to what we have today. We will need to place efficiency and lower carbon footprints above how loud an exhaust is or how many 1,000 pounds it can tow, even though we know we never actually tow. But if we do suffer that massive quote-unquote market readjustment and the concept of what's expensive or not changes, those of us who have helped to get to where we are now will still be there, for the most part, trying to drag us back to that relationship with large and heavy and overpriced V8 vehicles with overt consumption and consumerism. And if we want to change that, we're going to have to do what Democrats did in Wisconsin last week in their Supreme Court election decision: reject the implied superiority of those with oodles of cash and instead invest in projects and a world where everyone is lifted up, not just those with deep pockets and a massive disregard for anyone who didn't inherit their wealth from mummy and daddy. We're going to need to have a long, hard talk with ourselves about what we actually need and what's good for the world in which we live. And in that world, in that context, and in that discussion, I think Aptera has a very important part to play. The other fly in the ointment, though, well, that is ensuring Aptera stays true to its roots through all of this, avoids product creep and scope creep, and keeps its pricing away from the top end of the market, and ensures that it doesn't make those same mistakes that so many potentially revolutionary vehicles before it have made. And managing to do all of that with limited finances through the complexities of actually moving from production validation to actual series production. But that last bit is for a completely different video. Thanks for joining us today, and if you've got thoughts, make sure you leave them in our Discord chat room, on our Patreon page down below, or you can reach out to us using Mastodon or Blue Sky. Thanks to the amazing list of people scrolling by on your screen right now. They're part of the massive community of supporters who make this channel possible, helping us through Patreon and YouTube, covering our bills, paying our team, and ensuring we remain 100% independent. If you'd like to join them and see your name listed here, just follow the links below. We have options available across a wide range of different price points, starting from $1.50 US a month. A massive welcome to our newest supporters: Andrew Dijak, Alex Flinner, Mark Chopping, Squire, James Higgins Thomas, Crispy Noges, Charles Noun, B. Henke, DVDD, Maria van der Linden, Kay Firth, Scott Churchill, Nathan Okawa, Corporal Dwayne Hicks, T2 Roman, Michael Schaefer, Alon M, Peterson, Albert Beidou, Omar A. Kale, Robert Gee, and Nick. To join the list and get your shout out, become a paid Patreon member for your moment of fame, and now you can even gift membership to someone else. If you'd like to support us with a one-off donation, you'll find links below to make Ko-fi and Bitcoin donations, and we even have an old-fashioned PO box you can reach us at for the time being, address also linked below. You'll also find links to our swag store, and if you are someone who has to shop on Amazon, please consider using our affiliate link so we get the commission, not Jeff Bezos. So we can continue to focus on making our content even better and reduce creator burnout, we're doing a different set of release days this year and plan dropping new content every Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday on our main channel, plus something special on Sunday over on TE Take 2. And if you want more, the mighty algorithm that hates us thinks you should be watching this video, but we think this one is well worth watching too. Be awesome, be kind, be intentional, and don't forget to resist. Keep evolving!